If you are hiking alone late in the afternoon and your trail app suddenly pings to tell you that you've drifted onto an unmapped path called the Ridge Registry, turn back immediately. It doesn't matter if the sun is rapidly dipping below the horizon or if the woods behind you look identical to the trail you've been walking all day. Do not take another step forward. Do not convince yourself that it's just a shortcut back to the parking lot. Because once your boots cross the threshold of that dirt path, you aren't just a visitor in the forest. You have entered a closed, predatory ecosystem, and the trees are waiting to reclaim the physical weight you brought inside. My name is Owen. I've been an avid solo backpacker for nearly a decade, which means I'm deeply familiar with the isolating, meditative rhythm of the backcountry. I know how to read faded trailblazes. I know how to ration my water down to the last milliliter, and I know the exact psychological weight of watching the shadows grow long when you're miles away from the nearest trailhead. I've spent weeks in the deepest wilderness, entirely comfortable with the deep, heavy silence of nature. I thought I knew every peak, valley, and marked loop in the state park system. I was wrong. It happened last October during a crisp, late autumn trek on the northern loop of the Timberline Trail. It was roughly 4:30 p.m., and the sun was already beginning its steep descent behind the jagged mountain peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the forest floor. The temperature was dropping fast, the autumn air biting sharply at my exposed skin. A heavy, unnatural silence had settled over the woods. The typical sounds of birds calling to one another, rustling small game in the underbrush, and the wind rustling through the high canopy had completely vanished. It left behind a stillness so profound, so thick that it made my ears ring with a high-pitched hum. I stopped in a small clearing and pulled out my phone to check my digital topography map, wanting to ensure I reached the designated campsite before total darkness set in. The screen flickered violently. The digital compass began spinning aimlessly in a chaotic circle before the entire map interface glitched out. A stark, system-level error message locked across the glass. GPS signal lost. Searching for network. I gripped my trekking poles, a cold spike of anxiety hitting my chest. I looked up from the screen. The main trail ahead didn't continue smoothly. Instead, it suddenly split, branching off into a narrow, unmaintained dirt path lined with ancient, gnarled pine trees. These trees didn't grow straight up toward the light. They seemed to lean inward over the path, intertwining their branches like jagged fingers, intentionally blocking out the fading light of the sky. Right at the entrance of this unmapped path, nailed directly into a rotting wooden post, was a rusted iron plate. Written in a stiff, geometric, hand-carved handwriting was a single directive. Log your coordinates before passing. The perimeter closes at dusk. Assuming it was just an old ranger station check-in point from decades past, perhaps left behind by logging crews, I stepped onto the path to look for the logbook. The moment my boots touched the dark, tightly packed dirt of the new trail, the howling mountain wind abruptly ceased. It didn't taper off. It stopped instantaneously, as if a heavy, soundproof vault door had been slammed shut right behind me. The air became dead, pressurized, and transitionally freezing, clinging to my skin like a wet shroud. A few yards down the path stood a small, dilapidated wooden kiosk, its cedar shingles covered in pale green moss. I approached it, my breath blooming in thick white plumes of vapor that hung perfectly frozen in the still air. There was no paper trail map inside, no informational brochures about local wildlife. There was only a massive leather-bound book resting flat on an angled wooden ledger stand. I reached out, my thick hiking gloves brushing against the cold leather, and flipped the heavy cover open. The pages inside weren't standard hiker registries. They weren't filled with names of tourists or casual day hikers. They were thick, yellowed sheets filled with thousands of rows of neat, handwritten text, written in a dark, gelatinous fluid that smelled faintly of copper and old, stagnant pond water. I leaned closer, squinting in the failing light, and read the latest entries. Hiker 104 contributed left lung, exchanged for clear weather. Hiker 112 contributed right eye, exchanged for directional awareness. My eyes frantically raced down to the very bottom line of the current page, where the dark, thick ink was still wet and glistening on the paper, reflecting the faint blue light of my dying phone screen. Hiker 119, Owen, contributed physical form, exchanged for permanent structural integration. A sharp wave of pure, primal panic flooded my chest. I backed away from the kiosk, my boots slipping slightly on the damp dirt. My hands shook so violently that I dropped both of my trekking poles. The sharp clatter of the aluminum poles against the rocks echoed loudly, ringing through the dead silence of the woods. I didn't bother to pick them up. I turned on my heel and bolted back toward the main trail, running as fast as my heavy backpack would allow, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. But as I sprinted through the twisting, gnarled trees, I realized the landscape had completely altered in a matter of seconds. The path behind me didn't lead back to the Timberline Trail. The dirt path simply vanished into a vast, endless abyss of absolute, unrendered blackness, stretching out into infinity, swallowing the forest whole. The trees behind me were gone, replaced by a void so dark it seemed to pull the light right out of the air. Suddenly, my phone violently vibrated in my pocket. The vibration was so intense, so rapid, it felt hot against my leg. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. The trail app had forced itself back online, but the topography map was entirely gone. A single text alert had locked across the glass display, completely replacing the user interface. Greater than system alert, spatial deviation detected. Hiker has crossed into unlisted Sector 0. Local stamina reserves cannot sustain transit across the void. To exit the perimeter, you must balance the local registry. I slowly turned around, my back pressing hard against the trunk of a massive freezing pine tree. The cold from the bark seeped right through my layers of flannel and Gore-Tex. Through the dim, bleeding twilight, I noticed that the trees surrounding me weren't blowing in the wind. Their bark was actively shifting, undulating like muscles moving under tight skin. And as I watched in absolute paralyzed horror, the rough wooden knots on the trunks slowly opened up into wide, horizontal tears. They were wet, toothless grins, splitting the ancient wood from side to side, exposing raw, white pulp beneath. From the dark canopy directly above my head, a low, multi-layered voice broke through the silence. It didn't sound human. It sounded like the scraping of heavy branches, the grinding of ancient roots, and the crushing of dead leaves, all whispering in flat, rhythmic unison. The inventory must balance, Owen. Sign the book, or your bones become the new trail markers. I looked down at my phone screen one last time as the battery life rapidly drained from 90% down to 0 in a single second, zapped by the extreme, unnatural cold radiating from the tree behind me. Before the glass went completely dark, the app typed out a final, automated log entry across the black screen. Transaction pending. Mass designated as primary currency. Thank you for hiking with us. Before I could even let out a breath to scream, the remaining sunlight completely died, plunging the forest into total, absolute darkness. And through the heavy, suffocating silence, I heard the slow, rhythmic snap, snap, snap of long wooden branches bending completely backward, moving steadily down from the canopy toward where I stood trapped against the bleeding bark. Double tap if your stomach just dropped. Share this video to scare a friend who loves solo hiking, and hit that follow button right now so you never miss another late-night nightmare.